Hello and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you might be. My name is Bob Clements and I'm the president of Axsium Group, and welcome to Retail Responds. For the last 10 weeks or so, we've been holding Retail Responds webinars on a weekly basis. And the last time we held one, which was about 2 weeks ago, I went on vacation last week, but we also use that as a bit of a pivot for us. We're as a bit of a break point, if you will. And that break point is intended to really signify a change that's happening in all of retail right now. And that change is a shift from reopening to being reopened. And now we're starting to turn our attention to really the road ahead. And so just like you, Axsium is going to be pivoting from our talk track around what's happening, from the things that we need to plan for as we reopen our stores to start talking about what we need to do as we look ahead, whether that's over the next couple of months or whether that's over the next couple of quarters or whether that's over the next year or more. So today we wanted to introduce a guide, a roadmap, for lack of a better word, that is intended to help organize our thoughts and organize our actions as we move past reopening. As we get into it, we'll talk about some of the fluidity and the flexibility of what that roadmap is and what it looks like, because we're not the only one that's talking about roadmaps these days. It feels like everywhere you look, whether it's from governments or industry experts or whatever it might be, everybody has their own flavor of what phase 1 is and phase 2 is and phase 3 is or phase 5 or whatever it might be. And Axsium, in some respects, is just another voice of an industry expert, for lack of a better word. But so we've tried to design our roadmap to be something that is, number one, specific to people that care about workforce and workforce management related things. So obviously that we're workforce management experts. So we're going to talk a lot about labor and how this affects your associates and your ability to support your associates. And because it is workforce management, we recognize it's going to play in with other aspects of your organization and other industry as well. So when we talk about a roadmap here, we're really trying to design a roadmap that's relevant for you and for those that care about labor, and allows you to play nicely and neatly with others in your organization, if that makes sense. So we're very excited to share it today. I guess, as far as today goes, unlike previous Retail Respond episodes, you just get me today. And the reason is because I wanted to be able to focus on laying out our roadmap and explain some of the logic behind that. If you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat window to ask me those questions. Depending on how it goes, I may ask you to unmute, but most likely I'll just try to address those questions straight on. So feel free to use that chat window as you see fit. But I do want to get into the roadmap straight away, and I do have a slide that we're going to build as we start to share the roadmap. So why don't I go ahead and get into that? And in the spirit of having a hard time walking and chewing gum at the same time, I'm going to I need to tap dance here for a minute while I then go off and share my screen. So hopefully now everybody can see my blue slide that says the roadmap for Retail WFM. And again, I wanted to kind of build this up for you as we get into it. And as we start looking ahead, or as we start thinking about both where we are and where we're going, I think we have to start with the idea that we are reopened. Now, I know that not every retailer is reopened right now, and I know not all of your stores are reopening or have reopened yet. I think that the reality is that reopening is going to be a bit of a gradual process. But when we think about the roadmap, we pin the start of that roadmap from reopening. And again, what we're thinking about here is that we see that there are several phases that are going to follow reopening. And let me take you through each of those phases. And then what I want to do is I want to talk you through the societal and the cultural and the demographic influences that are things that are going to influence those phases. And then I want to talk specifically about how that's going to influence labor, how that's going to influence workforce management, how it's going to influence the way that people are working in your stores, and we'll probably wrap it up shortly after that. But like getting back to the beginning, then let's talk about the different phases of the roadmap. And like I said, it starts with reopening. Once we reopen, we move into what we're thinking about as being the react phase. Now, a lot of us may recoil a little bit at the term react, but the reality is that over the next couple of weeks and next couple of months, we are going to be reacting. We're going to be reacting as we work to really stabilize and learn about how our retail stores are going to operate in this new environment. And some of that reacting is going to be reacting to changing legislature and changing rules that we're going to be following. So for example, in my home state of Illinois, we opened retail last month for curbside pickup, but we didn't allow any retailer or any customers into the stores. Now it's as of the end of end of the month, we're now allowing customers to come into the stores at a limited capacity. And we can imagine that down the road, as the positivity rate lowers further, we're going to see more customers being allowed in the stores, but still a limit to capacity. And I think that Illinois is just one example. Whether we're looking at the rest of the United States or whether we're looking more broadly than that, we're going to have to be reacting to changing landscape just on the rules, much less anything else. And I'll talk about those in a little bit. But our goal ultimately is to stabilize and to learn, so that then we can start to apply those lessons to the next phase, which is to refocus. And really, from our perspective, our refocus phase allows us to refocus on our core business, refocus on profitability, refocus on driving our business forward. And during that time is when we're going to be operationalizing and when we're going to be evolving. So we're going to be operationalizing those processes that we implemented in the first phase. And frankly, when we implemented those processes, whether it's curbside pickup or the health and sanitation processes or whatever it might be, or whether it's a new way to think about scheduling or different processes for timekeeping, we're doing that a little bit piecemeal right now based on the store and the region and whatnot. And as we open up more stores, we're not going to be able to scale that way. We're not going to be able to drive the profits that we expect to be able to drive because our costs are going to be out of line, frankly. And so we need to operationalize, and we need to those processes so that they become efficient and that they become scalable as we really evolve our business over the next several months and several quarters. The refocus phase then leads us into the reinvent phase. And during the reinvent phase, we're starting to look ahead and we're starting to think about the future. Depending on when we reach reinvent, we may have a vaccine at that point. But even if we don't have a vaccine, the reality is that we'll have been living with COVID for a year at that point. And so from a society perspective, from a consumer perspective, from a business perspective, we'll be kind of used to working in a COVID environment. And at that point, we need to stop being crippled from COVID, and we need to start working and really reinventing ourselves as we start to think about what our customers' expectations is or want. And we're going to need to optimize what we're doing so that we can really thrive in the future. So when we think about it at the highest level, we start with reopen and we move through react, refocus, and reinvent as we drive ourselves for the future. So let's talk a little bit about where we are now and the things that can affect the timeline, because I haven't really talked about the timeline and what's kind of behind some of this stuff yet. So let's focus a little bit on that. And ultimately, where are we now? It shouldn't be a big surprise. We are in the react phase, right? Like I said at the outset, you probably have some stores open. You may not have all of them open. If you were deemed an essential retailer before, you certainly do have all of your stores open. But what you're seeing is a shift in business, right? The essential retailers that we work with are talking about how their businesses have started stabilizing. They've come off the Christmas high that they had before, and they're now kind of seeing a more steady state. For those that have reopened, You may be one of the lucky retailers that are seeing kind of some pent-up demand, so you're effectively seeing a spike or even a lift in labor. I've talked to a number of retailers that are seeing, comp store sales that are plus 10% from last year. And I've certainly talked to a number of retailers that are still working on recovery and are seeing kind of below year-over-year sales. But ultimately, we are in that react phase. And from my perspective, and I guess what I want to do as we start to break this down, I want to talk, let me talk a little bit more about timing, and then I'll talk about some factors that are involved in moving from one phase to the next. So when we think about react, we're not going to be in the react phase for very long. Our expectation is that react is probably going to take us over the next couple of months as we move through kind of the current phase of reopening. And again, as we think about that reopening, what we're going to see is that we're still social distancing. We have very limited capacity in our stores. The positivity rate is still relatively high in our populations, in our societies, et cetera. And again, we're going to be evolving fairly quickly as we work to reopen, as we start to stabilize before we get into the next phase. Now, I think the next phase is going to be a result of us transitioning through that stabilization period, where we're starting to see kind of things settle down. I'm not a huge fan of the new normal as a term, because I don't think there is normal. I think we're constantly evolving and we're constantly changing, and we're going to see a lot more change over the next 6 to 12 months. So, but I think that ultimately, as we navigate through the new now, which is where we are here, I think we'll get to a point where we're starting to feel that things have stabilized a little bit. And then as we start to transition into that refocus phase, refocus is really about refocusing on regaining market share and regaining revenue as we work through the holiday season. And then last but not least, as we move into reinvent, we're really talking about shifting gears into the future and how do we manage going forward. So at a high level, when we think about the reinvent phase, I think what we're really talking about is how do we get into the new fiscal year and even beyond. Now, there are a number of societal factors and business factors that are going to drive our ability to move through these phases, and ultimately what we're going to do around workforce management and what we're going to be doing around our labor. So to that end, when we think about the society factors that are going to affect us in our react phase, we are going to see some of that pent up demand. So are we going to be driving higher sales in certain stores or certain markets? I think we may see a little bit of a pop after we reopen, kind of like what those essential retailers saw. I think we're going to see maybe a bit more higher sales than we're used to as people get back into the market. We've certainly seen that with off-price retailers. We've seen that with a number of apparel retailers as well. But it's just not about pent-up demand. We're also going to need to be managing customer health and safety concerns. And those are going to end up being fairly regional based on the spread of COVID in those environments. But we're ultimately going to have customers and associates that have a certain level of expectation for what you're doing to help manage their health and safety. And again, we're going to be learning a whole lot about how best to navigate that. I was talking to one retailer the other day who had, for example, put in a nationwide policy that said, hey, we're going to wash our hands every 30 minutes. But what they actually found is that their customers, because they couldn't see people washing their hands, felt much more comfortable if their associates were wearing gloves rather than hand washing. And even though they felt that may not be as safe, what they did is they started having their associates wear gloves with the idea that they still expect them to wash their hands periodically. But I think you're going to be kind of navigating those nuances during this react phase and learning what makes your associates most comfortable and what makes your customers most comfortable as we navigate through that. I also think that we're we can't anticipate everything that's going to happen during this time frame, right? So I can talk about some of these society examples, but I think that we are going to need to expect other things that might happen as well along the way. And one of those things is the civil unrest and the protests and the riots and the looting that we've seen over the last, several days or the last week. That's had a dramatic impact on retailers nationwide. And unlike COVID, where, closing a store still meant that store was intact and that you had merchandise, and that it was really kind of a matter of how do I get my associates back, and how do I get them ramped up to speed in terms of our new procedures. The civil unrest has created a different level of complexity, where now stores need to be repaired, merchandise needs to be replaced in some cases, and the process of reopening is just another level of complexity that retailers will need to navigate during the react phase as they prepare to reopen again some of those stores. As we start shifting gear into the refocus phase, really one of the big drivers behind refocus is ultimately going to be the holiday. Ultimately, holiday represents, I don't need to tell you, but right, holiday represents your big opportunity for revenue and for profits in a normal year. And in a year like this, it represents an opportunity to make up some ground that might be lost. And so as we start to refocus on holiday and refocus on the fundamentals of the business, how do we prepare for holiday? How do we do holiday hiring and holiday sales? That becomes a big milestone to help drive us into that next phase. While we're going through that, though, we're also going to be needing to manage COVID-19 outbreaks, right? And I'm not talking about a major second wave that causes a nationwide shutdown. What I'm talking about is that as we look at different regions and different markets, I think that there's some expectation and plan that we should see, regional outbreaks or outbreaks in certain cities that may cause local shutdowns or may cause certain retractions or restrictions from a local perspective. And so we're going to need to be managing that while we're trying to manage through the holiday, and while we're trying to manage through that refocus period that we're talking about. And then we also have a very big event happening in the US this fall, which is the November elections. And so we're going to have to manage through the November elections, which could be another time for unrest, but it's certainly going to cause a distraction with a lot of people as we move through the second half of the year and move through the end of the year. But the goal is really to make sure that we end up having the best holiday that we can as we start to set ourselves onto a road of recovery. And once we kind of get through holiday and the dust is settled, then we need to start thinking about that time of reinventing ourselves, of optimizing and thriving in kind of a new world. As I said, at that point, by the time we get here, we'll have been living with COVID for more than a year. And if there's a vaccine, that's great. But if there's not, we will have had time to learn to live and get comfortable with how do we live day to day with social distancing? How do we live day to day with the hygiene and the kind of masks and things like that we may have to wear depending on where we are in the world. And it's at this point too, you're going to be thinking about, well, we're going to move into a new fiscal year and we're going to have a new budget, and what lessons have we learned and how are we going to navigate ourselves moving forward. At that point too, we're also going to be past that November election, and whether or not President Trump is reelected or whether we have a new president in place, the government should not be distracted anymore in terms of economic recovery. And we as a society won't be distracted. And so I think that economic recovery will have a clear path to the future. Now, again, we could see more COVID outbreaks. We could have other things that could get in our way that push us back. But ultimately, during the reinvention phase, we're really focused on economic recovery. I already mentioned this one before, which is living with coronavirus and finding a vaccine. Ultimately, that's, I think, kind of the state of our customer and associate mentality at that point. And so what can we do to be more successful? Now, up until this point, I've really spent a lot of time talking about the three phases. I've talked about kind of the societal, the cultural, the demographic impact that we're going to be thinking about that's going to allow us to move from one phase to another phase. But now let's kind of turn our attention here for the last part of the presentation to talk about what this means for workforce management, what it means for labor, and start to outline some of the things that I think everybody should be thinking about. And again, I'm just going through this at a 10,000-foot level in a 30-minute webinar today. Over the coming weeks and over the coming months, we're going to be drilling into this in our webinars. We're also going to be drilling into this with our customers that have engaged us to talk a little bit more about this. And I think it probably will evolve as we stabilize and learn, and as we operationalize and evolve, and ultimately as we optimize and thrive. I think that this is a little bit going to be, we're going to see more depth and more richness and more learnings as we go through this. So let's talk about those WFM things during that react phase. And again, when I think about this stuff, I'm thinking about it from a couple of different perspectives. So the first way I think about it is I think about it from a people perspective. I think about it from your workforce perspective. What's going on with them? What are their needs? What are their kind of what's happening with them personally from a skills perspective, learning perspective, et cetera. The second thing I think about is the processes. Those may be the workforce management processes, which is how do we think about scheduling, et cetera, or certain things that we need to do from a compliance perspective. But to me, it's also really about the work that they're doing, which is changing dramatically as we reopen from what it was before to what needs to be done now. And then I think that the third area of it is the technology. And obviously, when I think about technology, I think about workforce management technology, time clocks, scheduling, forecasting, all of that. But I also am thinking about it from a perspective of what other technology can we bring into play to help with health and safety, to help us focus on profitability, and to really help us ultimately to optimize and thrive in the future. So from a react phase perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges that retailers are going to need to address during this react phase is workforce agility. And that's both in the stores as well as in the support center. And whether you are an essential retailer that remained open or whether you are a non-essential retailer that closed, ultimately we have workforce shortage challenges at the moment. As we start to reopen, it's very difficult to get staff to come back in. We're often operating on minimums to begin with. We may be pulling from different stores to get people to come in to work. If I've been open for a while, I'm probably still feeling a little bit understaffed in many ways, or in some cases, I may need to start scaling back my workforce. But ultimately, I need to think about how agile my workforce is as I start to reopen more and more stores, or as I start to settle down once I come out of my peak period that we just faced. From a support center perspective, we might even have bigger challenges, which is that we might have furloughed or terminated, laid off a number of the people that are normally supporting our stores. And as we reopen, you are going to be stretched. And so how do you manage that from being stretched perspective? How do you get done all the things that you need to get done while your stores are getting done all the things that they need to get done? So that workforce agility, I think, is very critical during this react phase. And how do we address that? We're obviously going to be implementing a lot of new processes and tasks, or we may be modifying existing processes and tasks within the store. The obvious one that I point at frequently, which we've had to live with fast, is curbside pickup. Up until recently, curbside pickup was something that really mostly grocers just did, but it wasn't something that we saw in specialty retail or even saw in pharmacy. And now every segment of retail needs to address curbside pickup. It's an expectation from customers. And so we're going to be figuring that process out and realizing that the first process we put in place was not very efficient, and we're going to have to figure out how to make it better. So there's going to be a lot that we're going to learn over the next couple of weeks and months as we think about things like curbside pickup. And that's just scratching the surface, right? Let's talk about health and safety issues. Again, As we react and learn, I think we're going to see the mix of tasks in our stores change. We're going to be introducing new tasks, modifying old tasks, driving new processes in new ways. From a workforce management perspective, as we reopen, probably the biggest technology shift that's happening from a WFM perspective is around forecasting and scheduling. Your forecasting, if you haven't realized it yet, is broken. Your scheduling probably doesn't work, or auto scheduling doesn't work either, or if you are, you're getting schedules that aren't realistic. Most retailers I've talked to are not using forecasting and scheduling right now from an automated perspective. Instead, they're focused more on template-based scheduling to really try to simplify the process. I think some of the more forward-thinking retailers are thinking about how can we do more self-scheduling or self-management of scheduling so associates have a little bit more control over when they work and how they work, and ultimately fill our ranks a little bit more effectively. And that kind of gets us into how do we use mobile, not just for WFM, but to help manage change within my organization as well. As we start to shift to that refocus phase where we're really refocused on the business fundamentals and driving towards the best holiday that we can, I think we need to think about that onboarding process. How can we onboard people? And we're going to need to look at new techniques for onboarding people, because we're going to be limited in the number of people that we can have in our store. We need to move, we're going to need to focus on how do we rebalance the work that we're doing so that we've got non-essential work being done outside of operating hours so that we can maximize our store traffic and the experience that they get. And then also, how do we streamline and eliminate tasks and processes to scale and drive profitability as we get into the holiday, because those inefficient buy online, pick up in store processes will not scale as frequency increases. Finally, as we move to reinvent, I think we really need to think about how are we going to rewrite our customer experience to reflect our new customer expectation as we live with the coronavirus, or as we get to a vaccine. I also think that AI and robotics are going to be critical in terms of automating for the future as we try to right-size our cost model in our stores. I've put that in the reinvent phase because as much as we'd like to think about it during the refocus phase, refocus is really a finite period of time, and you probably don't have the money to go out and buy robots or figure out what even robots are going to work for you in the stores right now. That's something that we need to plan for the future, but ultimately will help you sustain and maintain profitability in the long term. So that's our view of the roadmap. I realize that I'm coming up to the top of the hour here, but like I said, this is going to be a centerpiece for the things that we talk about going forward. I hope today's session was helpful for you, and I encourage you to rejoin us again as we come back next week for our next Retail Responds webinar. We'll be back again next Thursday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, 8:30 a.m. Pacific, and 4:30 p.m. British Summer Time as we talk more about what life is like after reopening. So thank you for joining me, and I hope to talk to you soon.